It had been 40 years of silence, not quiet, silence, the kind that builds up in the corners of a room like dust, thick and undisturbed, where no one dares to touch. I came back from Afghanistan in body, yes, but my soul stayed buried somewhere beneath the sun-scorched gravel and the screams of 1982. People said, "Welcome home," handed me a beer, and changed the subject. And I let them. Because what could I say that wouldn't break me apart? No one knew about the nights I'd spend staring at the ceiling, afraid to close my eyes. No one knew I still whispered names in my sleep, names of men who never made it back. My wife once asked about the medal, the one I kept locked in the bottom drawer beneath old tax returns and manuals for appliances I didn't even own anymore. I told her it was nothing, a formality, but it wasn't. It was the only thing that still linked me to him. Then one day, decades later, there was a knock at the door, and everything changed. She stood there, a grown woman in a brown coat and determination in her eyes. Her name was Emily, and she was Sergeant Hector Miller's daughter. I hadn't heard his name out loud in almost 4 decades. And suddenly, there it was, hanging in the air between us like a ghost. She said she was researching her father's service, said she found my name in some dusty report, said she just wanted to know more. At first, I wanted to slam the door, not because I was angry, but because I was afraid. I had spent my entire adult life burying the past, and now it was standing on my porch asking for coffee. But I let her in, poured her a cup of the bitter black coffee I drink every morning, watched her sit at my old table, surrounded by the silence I had carefully built like a wall. She spoke gently. She didn't push. But when her hand brushed against the edge of the medal, forgotten on the table, it was like something inside me cracked open. I hadn't realized how much I needed to speak, how heavy silence can become. And in that moment, with her fingers lightly tracing the ridges of a decoration I never felt worthy of, I knew the story was no longer mine to keep. If this story is touching you the way it touched me while writing it, leave a like and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing real stories of love, war, and redemption. And now, get ready, because what happens next changes everything. She showed up on a cold November morning, the kind where the wind feels like it carries old stories through the empty streets. I heard the crunch of gravel on my front walk before I even saw her silhouette through the frosted glass. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one just drops by out here. But there she was, standing with a folder under her arm, a wool coat buttoned all the way up, and eyes that looked too familiar to be a coincidence. "Mr. Ray Thompson?" she asked, her voice gentle but steady. I nodded. "My name is Emily Miller. I believe you served with my father, Sergeant Hector Miller. I was hoping you might talk to me about him." There it was again, that name, Hector. A name I hadn't allowed myself to say out loud in nearly 40 years. A name I still whispered in my dreams. I stepped back to let her in, though part of me wanted to close the door, to protect what little peace I had left. But something about the way she stood, not desperate, not demanding, just quietly determined, made it impossible to say no. My house isn't much. A single-story ranch on the edge of town. The kind you drive past without noticing. Everything inside still looks like it did in 1989. Wood paneling, faded photos, a recliner that's molded to my shape. I made her coffee. Weak, burnt, the only way I know how. And we sat at the kitchen table like old friends who had never met. She spoke first. Said her mother didn't talk much about the war. Said the few stories she had were vague, unfinished. That she'd been trying to piece together who her father really was, not just the soldier, the man, and that somehow that search had led her to me. I watched her as she talked, and I swear I saw Hector in her. Not just in her eyes, though they were the same deep brown that used to narrow with laughter during our off hours. It was in the way she leaned forward, the way she listened, the way she tried to understand instead of just hearing. It shook me. It tore something loose inside me that I didn't know was still holding on. I wanted to tell her to go, to spare her whatever story she thought she was ready for, But I couldn't, because she didn't come with anger or blame or some forced sense of closure. She came with curiosity and grace and something I hadn't seen in a long time, hope. She asked me questions that hit harder than bullets ever did. What was he like when he wasn't in uniform? Did he ever talk about me? What made him smile? And I froze. Not because I didn't remember, but because I remembered too well. I told her bits and pieces, just enough to keep the silence from reclaiming the room. I told her about the time Hector fixed a radio with chewing gum and blind optimism, about the way he used to sing the same song every night, a soft country lullaby to drown out the chaos beyond the walls, about the photo he carried, a baby girl in his arms, both of them smiling like nothing could touch them. She listened like it mattered, like every detail filled a hole in her heart, and in doing so, it started to fill mine too. At one point, she reached for her notebook, and her fingers brushed the edge of my medal, the one I had accidentally left out on the table. Her touch was so gentle, so reverent, that I almost pulled it away, but I didn't. I let her hold it, let her feel the weight of it, the cold of it, the truth of it. She didn't say anything, just looked at me, and I think she saw it, the war behind my eyes, the ghosts I've kept company with for decades. When she finally stood to leave that day, she thanked me, not just with words, but with her presence, with the way she paused at the door, as if leaving meant something, as if she understood that something had shifted, not just for her, but for me. After she was gone, I sat there at the table for a long time. The coffee had gone cold. The medal still shimmered faintly under the light, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like it was mocking me. It felt quieter, like maybe, just maybe, I was ready to start telling the story I'd buried for so long. I remember that day better than I remember my own birthday. Funny how that works. The mind doesn't cling to celebration, it clings to survival. The valley in Afghanistan was hot and deceptively quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin itch. We knew something was coming, we just didn't know when. And then it hit. A chaos of gunfire and smoke, and the kind of fear you can't ever fully describe. It wraps around your spine and nests there, forever. Hector and I were pinned down behind a half-crumbling wall that smelled like sun-scorched earth and rusted blood. I had frozen, not in panic but in calculation, trying to find the next move. But Hector didn't wait. He grabbed me by the collar, yanked me back just as a bullet cracked against the concrete where my head had been a second before. We ran, staggered, dove into a ditch that offered just enough cover to breathe. And then I saw it, the blood. Hector had been hit. I crawled to him, already screaming for help on a radio that was half dead, static spitting more than signal. He looked at me, calm, too calm, and said, "If you make it out of this, tell her. Tell Emily I fought for her, that I didn't forget her." I nodded. Not because I believed he was dying, but because we always made those kinds of promises. You tell yourself they're just words, that no one will have to cash them in. But he did, and I didn't. He died in that ditch. I held his hand until the grip went slack. I remember staring at his dog tags, thinking maybe they would glow or pulse or do something to prove it wasn't real. But they just laid there, like any other piece of metal. Cold, final, indifferent. I got out. I came home. Not to banners or parades. That only happens in movies. I came home to a quiet apartment, a wife who didn't know how to reach me, and a medal I didn't want. They handed it to me like it was supposed to mean something. But all I saw was Hector, his blood, his voice, that last promise. So I buried it. Not literally, though that might have been kinder. I shoved it in a drawer, under old receipts and instruction manuals, and I tried to forget. I told myself that silence was strength, that if I didn't talk about it, it wouldn't own me. But silence, I learned, isn't an escape. It's a cage, one you build with your own hands and then forget how to unlock. I never told my wife the whole story. I couldn't. What would I say? The reason I flinch when you close a drawer too hard is because it sounds like a sniper round. Or I made a promise to a dying man and I failed him, so now I sleep on the couch even when the bed is empty. No, I just said I was tired, that I needed space, and she gave it to me, not knowing that space was already all I had left. Years passed. The medal stayed where it was. Sometimes I'd pull it out late at night, feel the cool metal against my palm, and wonder what Hector would think if he saw me now. Would he be angry? Disappointed? Would he forgive me for letting the years stack up without a word to his daughter? I don't know. What I do know is that medal never felt like mine. It was his, or maybe ours, a piece of a story neither of us got to finish. It weighed more than it should have, not in ounces or grams, but in guilt and memory, and a silence that thickened like smoke in a closed room. When Emily touched it, that day in my kitchen, something shifted. It wasn't just the moment. It was a current, electric and undeniable. She wasn't just Hector's daughter. She was the keeper of a story I had failed to tell. And her fingers, delicate but certain, made contact with the past in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in decades. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the table with the medal in front of me, just staring, and then I started writing. Not to be noble, not to unburden myself, just to begin. A few lines, a page. Details I thought I'd forgotten came back like ghosts in the hallway. Heavy boots, sand in my mouth, the smell of blood on fatigues. It hurt. But it hurt differently than before. Not like shrapnel, more like healing, like stitching up a wound that had stayed open too long. It wasn't the big questions that got to me, not the ones about dates or battles or medals. It was the small ones, the human ones, the ones that reached past the armor I didn't even realize I still wore. Emily didn't interrogate, she invited. Her voice was always calm, always respectful, but her words cut through me like a bayonet in soft cloth. What kind of music did he like? That was the first one that stopped me cold. We were sitting in the living room, her cross-legged on the carpet like a kid again, me in my old recliner, nursing a cup of tea I didn't even want. I looked at her, then at the wall, then at my hands. I hadn't thought about it in years, but it came back instantly. Country, I said, old school. Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings. He used to hum this one song, not even sure what it was called. But he said it reminded him of home. She smiled. That sounds like him. How would you know? I asked, instantly regretting the edge in my voice. She didn't flinch, just shrugged. I don't, but I want to. And that's how it went. One question, then another, each one opening a door I had boarded shut. She asked what made him laugh, and I told her about the time Hector put a scorpion in our lieutenant's boot, not to harm him, just to see him dance. She asked if he was afraid, and I said yes all the time, but he had a way of making fear look like courage, like showing up was enough. She asked how he died, and I told her every detail, no sugarcoating, no theatrics, just the truth. She didn't cry, not out loud, but I saw her hands tremble. And then, without a word, she reached across and held mine. That small gesture did something to me. It reminded me that I was still human, that somewhere under all that silence and guilt and memory, there was still something warm. We talked for hours over the course of those days. She would bring old photos, faded Polaroids of a man I once knew, smiling on a lawn, holding a baby, Emily as an infant. I didn't recognize the baby, but the smile. I'd seen it before, in the trenches, in the dark, when hope felt like a dangerous thing. He carried her with him everywhere, not physically, emotionally, spiritually. She was his lighthouse, and now she was mine. She asked if I had any of his things. I didn't, but I had stories, dozens of them. Some I told, some I held back, not because I wanted to, but because they hurt too much. You'd think that time dulls pain. It doesn't. It just teaches you how to carry it better. Like a limp you stop noticing until someone points it out. At one point, she looked up at me and asked, "Do you think he forgave you?" I didn't know how to answer that. I had never said it out loud, but she knew that I blamed myself, knew that I had carried the weight of that broken promise like a cross on my back. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I hope so." She nodded slowly. "I think he would have. I think he'd be glad you're telling me now." That night, I wrote more than I had in years. I filled pages. Memories poured out like floodwater breaching a dam. I remembered the way Hector would carve his initials into his rifle stock, the way he'd talk about barbecues and softball games like they were the only things keeping him sane, the way he'd look up at the stars and whisper her name like it was a prayer. Emily read every word. She never interrupted, never corrected. Just sat with me, listened with her whole presence, and let me unravel at my own pace. One afternoon, she recorded our conversation, said she wanted to keep his story alive. At first, I hated the idea. My voice on tape, vulnerable, unguarded. But then, I heard it, and for the first time, I didn't sound broken. I sounded real. I told her things I hadn't told anyone, not even myself, about the fear, the guilt, the dreams I still had where I was running through sand, always too slow, about how I used to talk to Hector in my head, hoping he'd forgive me, hoping he'd tell me I did okay. Emily never tried to fix me. She didn't come here to heal me. But somehow, in giving her her father back, even in fragments, I started to find pieces of myself I thought were gone forever. It was her last night in town. She had said she needed to head back to her job, her life, the orbit she'd been pulled from just long enough to sit with my memories. I knew this moment was coming, but knowing didn't make it easier. In just a handful of days, she had taken root in a place I thought long dead, and now the thought of her leaving felt like winter coming too soon. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where everything had started. The light above buzzed faintly, casting long shadows over the surface. Outside, it was raining. Not loud, just steady, like a quiet drumbeat for things unsaid. She didn't say much that evening, neither did I. Sometimes words aren't necessary. Sometimes presence is enough. The medal lay on the table between us. I had placed it there deliberately, not to make a statement, but because I couldn't hold on to it anymore. For years, it had lived in the back of a drawer, beneath paperwork and forgotten manuals, out of sight, but never out of mind. That little circle of metal had carried the weight of everything I couldn't say, and now, somehow, it felt lighter, just lying there. Emily noticed it, of course. Her eyes were drawn to it the way mine always had been, not because of the honor it supposedly represented, but because of what it truly meant. She reached out slowly, tracing the edge of it with her finger, like she was trying to read a language written in silence and blood. "Is this his?" she asked, almost a whisper. I shook my head. "No, it's mine. They gave it to me when I got back. But if I'm honest, I never felt like I earned it." She didn't respond right away, just kept her hand resting gently near the medal. I watched her, the daughter of my friend, of my brother in arms, sitting across from me in the home that had once been a fortress of solitude, and in that moment something broke open again, but this time it didn't hurt, it healed. "I want you to have it," I said. My voice didn't shake, but it wasn't steady either, not because you need it, but because it belongs with you, because part of him is in it, and part of me too, and maybe now it can mean something more. She looked at me. Really looked, the way Hector used to when he knew I was lying to myself. Then she nodded slowly, with tears starting to pool but never falling. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for this, but for coming back, even if it took you a while to speak." That's when it happened. The tears I hadn't shed in decades, not at funerals, not in therapy, not even alone, came, and they came hard. I cried for Hector, for myself, for all the years wasted in silence, and she didn't look away, she didn't shrink. She just reached across the table and held my hand, letting me cry without shame. It wasn't weakness, it was release, like finally exhaling after holding your breath for far too long. The medal was no longer cold. In her hands it became warm, not because of body heat, but because of meaning, because it had finally found its rightful place. Before she left that night, she promised she'd come back, not just to visit, but to listen, to keep learning. "There's more," she said. "I want to know more. About him, about you. I don't think either of your stories is finished." I believed her. For the first time in a long time, I believed someone when they said they'd return. After she was gone, I sat at that table in the quiet. But it wasn't the same quiet that had haunted me for years. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't sharp, it was gentle, like the house was breathing again, like I was. The medal was gone from the table, but I didn't feel its absence. In fact, I felt more whole than I had in decades, because it had never been about the medal. It had always been about the story, and now someone else was carrying it forward. The medal is no longer with me. It rests in Emily's hands now, somewhere far from this quiet house, in a city full of noise and movement and new beginnings. I don't miss it, not because it meant nothing, but because for the first time, it means something more. It's not a reminder of silence anymore. It's a symbol of the story finally told. Since that night, I've started writing again. Letters mostly, to Hector, to myself, sometimes to no one in particular. I fill yellow legal pads with memories, fragments, questions I never dared to ask. I don't always find the right words, but I try. Because the act of trying, the reaching, is what brings breath back into the rooms I thought would always stay empty. I've learned that silence is not peace, it's weight. It builds slowly, like dust in corners, like rust on the soul. You carry it until you forget what it feels like to speak. But when someone listens, truly listens, the silence begins to crack. And through those cracks, light can finally come in. I don't know what Emily will do with the stories I gave her. Maybe she'll write them down. Maybe she'll keep them tucked inside her memory, to be passed down like heirlooms to children who never met their grandfather. Or maybe she'll just carry them inside, quietly, like she carried the courage to come find me in the first place. What I do know is this: she gave me back my voice. She didn't force it out of me. She didn't demand answers. She simply asked, and then stayed. And in that staying, in that patient presence, I found something I thought I had lost for good, a reason to tell the truth. Hector isn't just a memory now. He lives in those words, in every page I write, in every breath I take that isn't laced with regret. And I, for the first time in decades, feel like I've come home. The past doesn't vanish, it doesn't fade, but it can be carried differently. With tenderness, with meaning, with love. The kind of love that shows up at your door, holds a cold medal in her hand, and asks about the father she never knew, not to blame, but to understand. That's what Emily did. And because of her, I'm not just a veteran anymore. I'm a witness, a storyteller, a man who broke his silence not with noise, but with memory. And maybe, just maybe, that's what redemption looks like. We share new stories every day, real stories that move, heal, and inspire.